provinces are back to general community quarantine, but the government is changing some guidelines for GCQ. President Duterte earlier said he has huge trust in Russia's vaccine candidate Sputnik 5, but the Department of Science and Technology says they cannot start clinical trials in the Philippines just yet. Yesterday's magnitude 6.6 earthquake created a sinkhole in Masbate. Damage to infrastructure has now reached almost 24 million pesos. The Senate has started its probe into the shooting incident that killed 4 Army intelligence officers in Sulu last June, but the NBI and the police officers involved are telling conflicting stories. Meanwhile, over at the upper house, Senate President Tito Soto is ending their probe into alleged anomalies hounding PhilHealth. They say they're tired of hearing a carousel of lies. And in today's NBA action, the Trailblazers spoiled LeBron James' playoff debut with the Lakers. Public transportation resumes as Metro Manila and nearby provinces shift back to general community quarantine today. The LTFRB is also preparing for the possible reopening of provincial routes. J. Cosico with the story.
The LTFRB disclosed that they are preparing for the possible reopening of provincial bus routes. But as early as now, some elected officials are already against this proposal. Case in point, LGUs in Central Luzon want to keep their borders closed.
We already had a meeting with the umbrella organization of the locally elected officials kung saan nagsabi sila na a large majority of the provinces are still not willing to open up their borders.
In the meantime, city buses and train lines are now up and running again as Metro Manila and the provinces of Laguna, Rizal, Bulacan, and Cavite shift back to general community quarantine. To date, the LTFRB has authorized over 3,000 public utility bus units to ply 31 routes in NCR and nearby provinces. The agency has also added more routes for UV Express and traditional jeepneys.
LTFRB is committed to continue to plan for more routes to be open in the coming days, if not weeks. At the end of the week, we would be able to announce also another set of routes to be open.
Meanwhile, 18 train sets were dispatched in the MRT-3 today. Regular disinfection is being conducted to avoid the spread of COVID-19. MRT employees wore PPEs and underwent COVID-19 testing before returning to work. Recall that MRT-3 operations were halted last month amid rising number of infections among its employees.
Sa ngayon po, manageable na po ang ating COVID monitoring. No? Marami na po ang naka-recover. Actually, sa MRT-3 personnel po, 10 ang naka-monitor na lang po sa atin na awaiting reswabbing para po makabalik na sila sa trabaho. While yung ating pong mga subcontractor ay mga around 60 plus na lang po ang minomonitor namin.
Apart from the regular thermal scanning and signing of health declaration forms, commuters are now also required to wear face shields as earlier ordered by the Transportation Department.
Okay po siya, maganda. Yun nga lang po, mainit pagka mainit and then nagmo-moist. Pero sa kaligtasan, okay po siya. Tiis-tiis lang po.
For News 5, JC Cosico, we are One News.
Metro Manila is back under a more relaxed quarantine, but even so, health protocols for public transportation have become more stringent. Jenny Dongon with the story.
Jeepneys are once again back on the road with Metro Manila and nearby provinces back in general community quarantine. However, some drivers are not yet allowed to operate despite the LTFRB authorizing 2,200 units in 34 new routes today. Along Rizal Avenue, traditional jeepney drivers plying the Baclaran Divisoria and Baclaran Monumento routes are still awaiting their fate. Since March, Delphine Cantado and his fellow drivers were unable to work. He said nearly half of their group have decided to return to their provinces due to the lack of income.
Ano lang, mga bigay-bigay ng barangay tsaka yung bigay ng mga bigay-bigay dito na mga ayuda. Yung mga sa mga nakikita dito ng mga kotse, binibigyan kami.
Personnel from the PNP Highway Patrol Group conducted a mobile checkpoint along Commonwealth Avenue in Quezon City this morning. Some bus drivers were apprehended and issued citation tickets for violating health protocols. Aside from face masks, face shields are now also required in public transportation.
Tinitingnan natin kung sumusunod sila sa mga health protocols katulad ng pagsusuot ng face mask at yung face shield.
Passengers with no face shields were ordered to alight. Some tried to make excuses.
Alam ko na sa bag ko kasi nakalimutan, mamadali kasi ako eh. Kasi kailangan ng pamilya ko ng pera eh.
The Highway Patrol Group also inspected motorcycle riders. Barriers will no longer required for riding in tandem who are living under the same roof. But the policy still applies to motorcycle riders and back riders with separate residences.
Sinabihan lang namin sila na pwede nang walang barrier as long na magkasama sila sa isang bahay. Pwede magkapatid o mag-ama, pwede na sila kahit walang barrier. Basta yung bahay nila ay isa lang yung address nila.
Motorcycle back riders will need to present a document or ID indicating their shared address. Mobile and surprise checkpoints will continue, particularly on major thoroughfares in Metro Manila, to ensure that IATF guidelines are being implemented and followed. For News 5, Jenny Dongon, WR1 News.
The National Task Force Against COVID-19 has released a fresh set of guidelines for Metro Manila and surrounding provinces that have transitioned back to GCQ. Under the guidelines, mass gatherings of more than 10 people are not allowed. Salons, barber shops, dine-in services in restaurants are allowed to resume operations provided they adhere to capacity limits set by their respective LGUs. Other personal care establishments such as gyms, internet cafes will remain closed. A unified curfew is also imposed over Metro Manila. That's from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. Meanwhile, the use of quarantine passes will depend on the local government units. Motorcycle barriers, as we've mentioned, are now only required for back-riding individuals coming from different households. Face shields are mandatory for all, especially in commercial areas, workplaces, and in public transport. At the beginning of the pandemic, most COVID-19 cases in the country involved the elderly. But recent data shows there's been a change in demographics as more and more young Filipinos are getting infected. This was over the past few weeks. Camille Samonte with the story.
Clarice stayed for a month at a quarantine facility in Manila after she had tested positive for COVID-19. 3 of her family members also tested positive, and all of them were asymptomatic. Clarice, who is only 24 years old, said she thought her immune system was strong enough to fight the virus.
Nagulat and then sobrang nalungkot kasi parang lahat naman ng pag-iingat ginagawa ko and then nagkaroon pa rin. Seryosohin natin yung baka galing ka sa labas ng bahay, huwag ka munang papasok ng kwarto or ng bahay nang hindi ka na-disinfect or hindi ka naliligo. And then yung phone na laging hawak, yun yung mas kapitin ng virus kasi laging hawak ng kamay. Parang laging i-disinfect yung phone.
Now, Clarice and her family have fully recovered. The World Health Organization reported on Tuesday that more than half of the Philippines' COVID-19 cases are from the 20 to 40 years old age group. Officials from WHO Western Pacific noted that the recent data shows COVID-19 is being spread largely by young people in the Philippines, Japan, and Australia.
We should recognize these are the age group who is active, but also when even you get the infection, you might not notice. So potentially becomes a important driving force of the pandemic.
Kasay said most of the patients from this group are unaware they are carrying the virus since they are asymptomatic or barely showing flu-like symptoms. Data from WHO is similar to that of the country's health department. The DOH said around 41% of the cases in the country are from the productive age group of 20 to 39 years old. The department also recently reported clusters of COVID-19 transmission in workplaces. The WHO warns young people not to be complacent and double their efforts in fighting the virus, as they are putting the elderly and other vulnerable people at risk. For News 5, Camille Samonte, we are One News.
We'll pause for a short break, but when the big story returns, local clinical trials for Russia's COVID-19 vaccine, Sputnik 5, will not be happening anytime soon. And a group of nurses cry foul over the IATF's new resolution suspending the overseas deployment of healthcare professionals. That and more stories after the break. I'm Robbie Alampay. You're watching The Big News. Local clinical trials for the Russian COVID-19 vaccine, Sputnik 5, will have to wait a bit more as the Philippine government holds out for necessary data on its initial studies. Greg Gregorio has the details.
The Department of Science and Technology is still waiting for the documents and regulatory procedures before the Phase 3 clinical trial of Russia's Sputnik 5 vaccine could start in the country.
Meron na kami kasing nakuhang konting information, yung synopsis lang nila, but we require the complete technical dossier to be submitted to FDA. So until that happens, hindi po namin fully evaluate yung kanilang product.
The Food and Drug Administration also said they will not approve a Phase 3 clinical trial without thoroughly reviewing all the necessary data generated from previous tests.
Gagawin naman natin yung isang masusing pag-aaral, technical review by our experts ng lahat po ng dokumento ng kanilang mga naunang phases, the earlier phases, including the preclinical studies, bago natin i-approve.
Thousands of individuals are needed for the Phase 3 clinical trial. But due to lack of necessary documents, the criteria for qualified volunteers remains pending. The DOST says data from initial clinical trials usually dictate which age group and target population can be included as subjects. As of now, what's clear is that it could only be given to healthy individuals who have never tested positive for COVID-19. Authorities also insisted that they will not allow any vaccine trial that would require the SARS-CoV-2 virus to be injected in a volunteer.
Unang-una, that is a violation of rights ng tao na kahit sa pumayag pa, alam natin na wala namang gamot para sa COVID-19 sa ngayon at para bigyan mo siya ng danger o posibilidad na magkaroon ng sakit kung hindi epektibo yung bakuna ay delikado at hindi tama.
Before a volunteer is chosen as subject for the trial, they will be asked to give an informed consent as part of ethical standards. Some adverse effects will be explained. These include fever and pain on the part of the body where the vaccine had been injected. Each volunteer will also be compensated.
Hindi pwede magbigay ng malalaking halaga. Bakit? Kasi baka yung mga tao ay sumasali hindi dahil naintindihan nila yung kung ano yung makukuha nila sa trial o voluntaryo nilang gagawin, kundi ginagawa nila dahil may bayad at malaki. So that's what we call undue inducement, no, sa clinical trial. So iniiwasan natin yan.
In the absence of the necessary data, the DOST said the timeline on the availability of the vaccine in the market by June 2021 remains an estimate. The FDA would also need to review the result of Sputnik 5's Phase 3 clinical trial before it could be given a certificate of product registration and have it released commercially. Meanwhile, aside from Sputnik 5, the DOST is also coordinating with other vaccine manufacturers, namely AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Moderna, Sinovac, and Sinopharm. The DOST admits it's impossible for the Philippines to develop a vaccine of its own anytime soon. For News 5, Greg Gregorio, we are One News.
Nearly 5,000 more COVID-19 cases were reported today by the Department of Health. 3,000 of these are fresh cases and they came from Metro Manila, although 90% of them are considered mild. There are now more than 57,000 active cases, while total infections have reached 173,000. More than 100 people died from the virus as of today, according to the DOH. Death toll stands at 2,795. A bit of good news, though. The department has tallied 716 more survivors. Total recoveries now stands at more than 100,000. A group of nurses are crying foul over the IATF's new resolution suspending the overseas deployment of healthcare workers. But the Labor Department says the country needs them here to fight the pandemic. Marian Enriquez tells us more.
We spent and we're about to lose our home, about to lose our livelihood kasi we sacrificed that all kasi dapat paalis na kami tapos hindi na naman matutuloy and we don't know when will this ban will be lifted kaya
34-year-old nurse April Glory bursted into tears during a virtual meeting with the Labor Department yesterday. She was initially set to leave the country in March to work in the United Kingdom, but the government had banned overseas deployment of healthcare workers during the lockdown. The POEA eased restrictions for healthcare workers in June as long as they already secured employment contracts before March 8. So April spent almost 100,000 pesos to process the documents she needed for her job in the UK. This includes her swab test result, which cost her 13,000 pesos.
Kasi ito yung negative swab test na kailangan namin for the flight sa Qatar Airways. Tapos ito yung yung OEC. Yan. Hinintay namin to ng more than 2 weeks para bigyan kami ng exit clearance. Tapos passport, yung visa namin. Yan, hinintay namin siya ng more than
April was supposed to fly to UK tomorrow night, but it looks like her plans would have to take a back seat once again due to IATF Resolution number 64 issued on August 17, suspending the overseas deployment of medical and allied health workers. Health workers like April, who had their signed employment contract on or before March 8, are also included in the resolution. Under the IATF resolution, the health department and all hospitals and healthcare facilities of LGUs are enjoined to hire healthcare workers who are currently prevented from working abroad.
Mas kailangan natin ang mga nurses dito sa ating bansa ngayon. And we cannot afford to be deploying our nurses abroad at the expense of losing the services of our nurses and medical workers here, especially na meron tayong problema sa pagtaas ng COVID contamination and transmission in our country.
April, who is also the vice president of a nursing group called Prison Nurse, said she tried applying to a COVID-19 facility, but she was not hired because the facility is not looking for a new nurse.
The reason is, it's the system that is faulty. Meron kaming mga kasama sa group na nagsasabi na until now, hindi pa sila sumusweldo. Yung iba naman, sumweldo, walang hazard pay.
April's group says around 600 nurses like her are affected by the IATF resolution.
So lahat ng pera namin na ginastos namin, hindi namin makukuha pabalik kapag hindi kami nakarating doon.
Secretary Bello vowed that he will bring up this issue to the next IATF meeting. For News 5, Marian Enriquez, we are One News.
These are the other big stories today. Senator Bong Revilla was rushed to the hospital on Tuesday afternoon, over a week after he tested positive for COVID-19. His wife, Bacoor City Mayor Lani Mercado Revilla, says the senator has developed pneumonia based on his latest x-rays. Because of this, doctors said isolation in a regular facility is no longer ideal. Yesterday's magnitude 6.6 earthquake created a sinkhole in the town of POV Corpus in Masbate. Environment officials have started assessments on the sinkhole, while 15 families living near the area have been evacuated. PHIVOLCS is clarifying that the emission of steam from Taal Volcano's main crater is all normal. In an interview with 1PH, PHIVOLCS chief Renato Solidum said this activity is not unusual for a volcano under alert level 1 status. He also said the photo of Taal Volcano that went viral yesterday actually showed thick clouds, not smoke.
Meron po tayong camera mismo sa loob ng crater at meron din tayong camera sa Taal Volcano Observatory diyan sa Talisay ay nagpapakitang walang mataas na usok.
Coming up on the big story, the Senate begins its probe into the shooting incident between Army and police officers in Jolo last June, and it is not off to a good start. And talking about a bad start, the Trailblazers just ruined LeBron James' playoff debut with the Lakers. Watch the game's highlights when the big story returns. This is the big story. I'm Robbie Alampay. After 3 days of Senate hearings on alleged PhilHealth irregularities, Senate President Tito Soto is now putting all of these to an end. Soto says he will be leaving the matter to the hands of the Department of Justice to take proper action. He adds the Senate is tired of hearing the agency's, quote, carousel of denials and lies. The Senate also adopted a resolution urging President Duterte to immediately suspend top officials of PhilHealth. Meanwhile, the Ombudsman has issued a suspension order against 13 PhilHealth officials due to alleged involvement in the anomalies within the agency. They all face a 6-month suspension for grave misconduct, oppression, and conduct prejudicial to the best interest of the service. Over at the lower house, Marikina Representative Stella Kimbo has filed a bill seeking to privatize PhilHealth amid corruption allegations hounding the agency. Kimbo says the agency is suffering from a failure of leadership due to lack of technical expertise in its top management. The Senate has started its investigation into the shooting incident between soldiers and police officers in Sulu that killed 4 Army intelligence officers last June. But the testimony of the cops involved contradicts the NBI report. Mian Los Baños with the story.
2 versions of the story on what transpired last June 29 were unveiled in today's Senate hearing. Based on the NBI's investigation, when the 4 soldiers aboard a gray Montero Sport passed by the checkpoint on their way to Patigul, Sulu, the police already called their attention. The soldiers were assigned then to do a surveillance operation on 2 suspected suicide bombers. Witnesses said the police were shouting and forced the army members to get out of the car.
The members of the Philippine National Police were allegedly rushing them up already, pointing their long firearms at them, even shouting, "Baba, baba kayong lahat dyan." One of the witnesses even said that nakita niya pa na nakasurround itong mga members ng Philippine National Police at narinig po niya na sinabi po ng Major Indamog at ni Corporal Asula na tropa.
The team led by Police Senior Master Sergeant Abdel Zimar Pajiri said he was the one who approached the Montero and asked the passengers to come to the police station.
At pwede rin po sila sumakay kayo sa white car namin kung pwede. Sabi niya, ba't kami sasakay sa sakyan? May sakyan kami.
The soldiers aboard the SUV heeded the advice of the Jolo police, but instead of parking in front of the Jolo police station, they went straight in front of the Bureau of Fire Protection. Major Indamog alighted from the SUV while 4 policemen also disembarked from the patrol cars and pointed their firearms at Indamog.
Si Major Indamog naman po at the time ay itinaas po ang kanyang dalawang kamay at sabi po ng ating witnesses ay tinaas din po ang kanyang t-shirt. Of the impression na pinapakita na wala namang nakapak or anything na sa kanyang bewang na siguro po weapon.
But the police team leader Pajiri had a different version of the story. He said he approached the Montero and knocked on the window of the front seat, finding Indamog holding an M4 firearm when he went down from the vehicle. However, the NBI insists Indamog was not carrying any firearm.
Our witnesses were very consistent with their statement that the first shots were fired toward the interior of the Montero Sport, Your Honor. Precisely why Major Indamog turned to his left to check on what happened, but then he was also fired shots upon.
The Jolo police also denied allegations that they planted evidence such as firearms that were seen at the crime scene. The NBI already recommended the filing of 4 counts of murder and 1 count of planting of evidence against the 9 policemen. Reporting for News 5, Mean Los Baños, we are One News.
Youth leaders have filed the 29th petition against the anti-terror law today. In a 105-page petition, sangguniang kabataan officers and youth community leaders from Luzon and Visayas challenged the controversial statute. They said the anti-terror law violates basic and essential rights. The youth leaders added that this law creates an atmosphere of fear and would have a chilling effect. They are now urging the Supreme Court to prevent its implementation. They add that an IRR will not remedy the supposed defects in the law. Fast break to some sports action. The Portland Trail Blazers stunned and drew first blood against the top-seeded Los Angeles Lakers in their playoffs today, 100-93. Damian Lillard was too hot to handle as he took over the final 6 minutes of the game, giving the Blazers its 5th straight victory. Lillard registered 34 points, spoiling LeBron James' first playoff appearance as a Laker. Meanwhile, LeBron's former team, the Miami Heat, scored a 113-101 victory against the Indiana Pacers. Jimmy Butler gave the Heat its early series edge with a game-high 28-point performance. And the Houston Rockets, without Russell Westbrook, turned out to be just fine as they outplayed the Oklahoma City Thunder 123-108. James Harden led the Rockets to a 1-0 lead with 37 points. And the Orlando Magic pulled a huge upset against Milwaukee Bucks, 122-110. The Bucks struggled to snatch Game 1 of the playoffs as Magic center Nikola Jokic dominated the court with 35 points and 14 rebounds. And that wraps up today's big story. Catch us again tomorrow, 8 p.m., Signal Channels 8 and 250. Please like our Facebook page, One News. For more in-depth analysis, visit our webpage, onenews.ph. You can also catch One News on the Signal Play app. Register for a free account now at signalplay.com and stream One News live anytime, anywhere. I'm Robbie Alampay, and we are One News. Good evening.